All right, so I'm gonna walk through how to add an API endpoint, a GraphQL endpoint for the serverless app here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna scroll up to this section. We're gonna find a section called mapping templates, and it's right here. And so basically, we're gonna comment this in, and we're gonna just work on creating a user right now. So we're gonna call this the data source will be users. You'll see what that maps to in a second. And we're gonna call this field is create user, and then we have a couple generic templates in here, and we don't need to do anything other than generic. So we're just gonna do generic response VDL, and then generic request, generic create request, and then a generic response right there. And you can open those up and look and see what's in there. Nothing spectacular, just some basic VTL stuff for mapping to the endpoints. Then we actually have to add the data source in here. So we're gonna comment this in, and again, here's where we get the name users from. So we're gonna put users down here, and this is the users table. And then we have this reference to, we're gonna call it the user table, and we have to add that. So when we have that, we're gonna be adding it. We're going to be adding it to the section under resources. I'll show you where that is in just a second. Just trying to grab my... Okay, now go to resources. Right here. And so basically we have our SMS topic. We're just going to drop this right underneath there. Oops, I didn't copy it. Hold on. Just trying to save us some typing here. Okay, and so what we have here is we have, it's not going to depend on anything. It's our first table, so it's not going to depend on anything. Billing mode, this is saying the type of resource it is. Billing mode, we're doing pay per request. This means that we have automatic scalability, and we only pay if there's a request through there, which is really good for applications like this where you don't know the throughput, especially up front. So then we have some attribute definitions here. We're not going to have an organization ID. We don't need to provision the throughput because we're doing billing mode pay per request. Table name, this is going to be the name of the table. And then we have some global secondary indexes. And so right now, the only one we really need here is, we're going to put in email, because you have to put in any attribute that you're going to use as a global secondary index. You have to define under attribute definitions. So we're going to call this email ID index, and the attribute will be, this will be so we can look up users by their email address. And then we'll call this ID, which it'll sort it by their ID. Again, we don't need to provision throughput since this is auto scaling, and we're all good there. So our serverless file is all good to go. Now we have our schema.graphql, which basically this is where we define how we're going to add this. So we have the type definition for user, so it's going to have an ID, a name, email, and then we're going to have created at and updated at. Then we have a user connection, which is just a paginated list of users under the items key. We have the valid attributes for creating a user. The reason why we make it optional to pass an ID is so we can do caching on the, so we can do anticipated responses on the front end. We can actually even add this here also, so we have a full response there. Then we add the mutation. We have one mutation, create user, and then one query, get user, and then one subscription on create user, which is just basically fires whenever a user is created. And then we add those definitions below to the schema. So we've already defined create user in here. You can see that right there. So it matches create user, create user. If we want to define a get user, type is query, get user, and then we have generic get and generic response. So if we wanted again add an update, which we will want to do, update user, and then we have generic update request, and then all we have to do is go in here and add this to the list of mutations. So we're going to have update user, and then we're going to have this update user input. So we actually have to create this input here. So we're going to say input update user. We're going to make the ID required, otherwise we don't know who we're updating. And then we don't want to allow them to update the name because that's actually a Cognito property. Same thing with phone and email address. Those are both Cognito properties. So actually, as we see here, we probably don't want to have an updated user input. So we can basically just wipe this out because any update to the user should be done through Cognito. Although we should actually have this just in case there's an update to Cognito and it needs to sync to our Dynamo table. So we'll leave this in here. And these are the properties that can update, and we'll just use that to sync with Cognito if Cognito's ever updated. So then we should be all good to go now with that aspect of it. The only thing we have to do is we now have to deploy this. So that should deploy and go ahead and create our, it'll tell us if there's any errors. If not, it should go ahead and deploy our new API endpoints. We just added 3. While it's doing that, I wanted to show you something. So the way we set this up here is we have this is the client to implement here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to again copy some stuff over here to make it a little bit easier. The first thing we're going to start with here is a user fragment. So I'm going to put in a fragment here for user.js. And then I'll go ahead and delete this. Okay, so now we have this right here. So we don't have this organization, and we don't have organization ID, and we don't have title. So we do have everything else except for assigned roles. And we're just going to close this in here just like that. And then our fragment is good to go. We also have to create the create user mutation. Oops. Again, I'm going to wipe out the stuff we're not using. And by the way, the create, add, and update, if you look in the generic create, it sets the created at and updated at. And so we actually use that in the updated template too, the update template. So now we have our create user all set. We're using that fragment that we created just a second ago. Now we have to add an update user. Which we'll grab from over here. Copy and pasting from another project. We'll get rid of title, organization, active, and then so we just basically have this. And then finally, by the way, our deploy finished. Looks like it's all good. And then we're going to finally add a query for get user. And we're just going to come over here and I'm going to copy this from over here, get user. And our API is all finished. Now, notice that the API is defined outside of the clients. We have the server, we have the React Native client, we have the React client, we have the API. These apps, React client, React Native client, won't let you import something outside of the root directory. So in order to share it, we basically have a little script. So if we go into, say, the React Native client, and we do, I think it's yarn update API, it automatically copies what's in this directory into a directory under there. So it just copies that. It's a little optimization. We could probably put a watch on there so it automatically updates the API folder with changes. But right now you just have to remember to run yarn update API if you add a new API there. From there, it's just a matter of following Apollo to implement the API. We can look at an example here. Let me see if I can find this. So we're going to copy over a function here. We're going to make it just like a create new user. So we have our Apollo client. We're telling it to use this API, and then we're passing a Cognito user, and then we're going to pass it email, phone. That's pretty much all we have to do. And then we basically on sign in, we're going to see what we're going to do is we're going to try to we have this handle sign in method. So basically, if after they authenticate, we're going to query to see if that user exists. If it does, we're just going to return that user. If it doesn't, we're going to create a new user, which creates and returns that new user. And so that's basically how you implement it. Well, you have to import the API too. So let me just do that. And now that we imported our API methods, you should be cooking with gas.